welcome back to another Kaijudo video. This time I'm going to be doing a discussion on the ban list that I've sort of come up with after thinking about it a little bit. I guess it could be a restricted list as well if you want to follow in line with how Bottle was restricted to one in the open format. But for all intents and purposes, they're probably going to be the same thing. Maybe if you were approaching it all as a limited list, it might change some of the thinking or maybe how you approach it. But I guess for this, it's going to be a ban list. I think it's 9 cards deep is what I kind of came to, at least as a start. I guess to preface a little bit about my approach to what I wanted to accomplish. It's a little bit more about kind of opening up the diversity of the play experience and maybe what kind of strategies are viable. Not so much diversity in like the actual civilizations that see play. I think it's really tough to tackle the dominance of the light civilization, even if you do hit like the super strong incentive cards to be playing light. Outside of that, there's just so many powerful cards. Like all the multi-civ tools that it gets, it's really hard to still ignore light as a civilization that you should be playing. But at least I would like to open up the door by hitting, I think as a consequence of hitting some of the super top level of the light cards, you open it up to be a little more competitive between the civilizations. But I guess going back to the kind of diversity, I'm thinking of fostering a little bit more in terms of like the reactive decks and being able to play, hopefully being able to play more successfully some just kind of spell-based decks, opening up those. Hopefully as a consequence of that, like fire might see a bit more presence as a color that can serve a role with its removal spells, and maybe also with control losing some of, or like the traditional control losing some of its tools, you can open up the door for a little bit more in terms of red-based or red-involved control decks. But yeah, just I guess making reactive decks a little bit better. I think when you look at Kaijudo, it's virtually all proactive decks. I mean, certainly that's in part due to the game itself, being a game with only creatures and spells, and the creatures being as good as they are. It's really tough to. I mean, it's really tough to warn a deck that's filled with spells. Just because, I mean, it's usually generally a better idea to play a reactive or a proactive strategy as opposed to a reactive strategy. And on top of that, as I touched on, I think in my fire video, the reactive tools they gave us in Kaijudo were really not equipped to answer the threats that they gave us in Kaijudo. So because of that, I want to kind of maybe diminish the threats a little bit so that there is more room for reactivity. Because even when you look at the control decks that are played in Kaijudo, another thing I touched on as well is they're basically just big mana decks, and they're very much proactive in their own respects. Like sure they're slower, and they use these kind of reactive tools like removal, like bone blades, and discard spells like mesmerize, which maybe that's, I don't know if you would necessarily qualify that as a reactive card necessarily. But even those control tools, they're not necessarily the primary game plan. A lot of the time, those reactive cards kind of come up as shield blast, but most of the time they're just going to be aggressively playing ramp spells. It's a lot more of a proactive strategy, very much a big mana ramp deck that is building up to just giant things and playing proactively playing stuff like, I mean, they're defensive-ish cards, but you're still proactively playing cards that set your board state ahead, like Andromeda and Haven and the like. But yeah, there are a lot more proactive strategies than you might assume. And even if you're playing like a non-nature kind of big mana control deck, it's still a lot about playing proactive stuff. Whether you're like using things like Blinder Beetle Prime that can turn the corner quickly, or I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little bit out of the depth that I need to be working at here, but I guess going back, that would be kind of like the goal, is just to foster a little bit more of, or make you a little bit more room for reactive cards to come into the game more successfully at the very least, making them somewhat more viable. Um, yeah, I think another thing too is like it's only going to be 9 cards long, this ban list. I think mainly addressing like some of what I think are like the key issues. A lot of like the most warping cards or most impactful cards. There's certainly tons of cards that are very strong, but I think when you jump into the ban list, I think you might tend to hit too many cards. Like people might tend to hit too many cards that are just like at the top level. Like they'll just touch every top tier card, or maybe they'll touch all the cards that see tons of play. And I don't think that's like the best way to go about change. Like if you want to change up the metagame, like if you just want to play Kaijudo differently, by just making it so, like if you just want to ban every good card that exists, and then play with the next tier of cards, like that's perfectly fine. Like that's a good way, I guess, if you want to change the game you're playing to a different one, or you want to explore new territory in the game and you want to just shift up or shift through the whole card pool. I guess you could do that. But for me, I just want to kind of address what I think are some of the key issues that are found within the gameplay itself, and that would be addressing like the 9 kind of problematic cards I see. Um, yeah, kind of a long-winded explanation to lead off there, but I guess that's kind of the norm for my videos. Going into the actual ban list, I think some of the cards that kind of go without saying, Bottle of Wishes, of course. There's not really a place for this card in the game. It's kind of just a little ridiculous that it was ever printed to begin with. I don't think we really need to go too much into that. Herald of Infernus, I think, is just way too oppressive of a card. It sucks that it's one of the few playable or like really strong red cards, and one of the cards that really incentivizes you to play or fire, but it's just too oppressive. Like maybe it's interactive in the minds of some, in the sense that your opponent is conscious of it and they're playing the game around Herald, but it's just doing its interactivity in not really the sense you want it. It just forces your opponent's hand in a lot of cases, and it's just too oppressive of a card. Finbarr is another very it's a super punishing card, especially for those reactive strategies. If your opponent's ever left in a position where they weren't able to answer all of your creatures, or Finbarr is so punishing. Like whatever board presence they do have, or you do have, your opponent has, you can just set them back with the Finbarr, and then any creatures left just start generating you back advantage. So it's super punishing to any deck that isn't able to answer all the creatures with removal. Like if the reactive deck doesn't have like the Waylay for your 2-drop, the Laser Eyes for your 3-drop, the Bone Blades for your 4-drop, like any creature left standing, even if they have their own maybe blockers out, it's just not. Finbarr is just so punishing, and really makes it so that like the decks that try to take out problematic cheap creatures with removal just don't function that well, because the Finbarr is just too good of a advantage engine. Andromeda is another easy hit for me. This is a card that kind of, it's when I'm gonna be banning like a few of like the really powerful kind of anti-control tempo, I guess traditional kind of tempo tools, I guess, like Finbarr for example, and Andromeda is just too good of a top end card. Like it makes all these like huge control decks viable, even given like the quality of like the cheap proactive plays and cheap I guess tempo cards that exist in Kaijudo. Even despite all that, Andromeda alone makes like these giant control decks viable. It's just way too good of a defensive card. Banning it really, I guess, opens the door for other big things to kind of take its place, and maybe incentivize some other colors to see play instead of light at the top end. It also might diminish the need to play this huge big things arms race in the control matchups that I think is kind of unfun and kind of unhealthy, where it just pushes the pile to get even more piley when you're both people have all these Andromedas and they're playing games where they're getting 7 or 9 shields. It makes it super difficult to play a game where you're not resorting to just Haven or Tritonus or like multiple Cassiopeias and School Scourges. It's really tough to navigate these games without just going way over the top when you're dealing with these 7 to 9 shield games where everyone just has a million cards. You really need, it just becomes this super drawn out. I mean, it just forces everything to be the pile when you're looking at control mirror matches, and then it just plays into the proactive kind of ramp game plan of just I'm going to live to Andromeda and get there as fast as I can, and then just Andromeda alone will carry me to victory. I think it's too good and pushes the game in a bit of an unhealthy direction, personally. Some other cards I would hit, I guess like the rounding out, I can't think what would be like maybe the 6 most obvious cards would be just the hexproof guys, Tricky Turnip and Laws. I think the hexproof is just an egregious ability. Being able to go for game, not have to worry about shield blast is one thing, but being able to just make it so your opponent can never like properly answer your board is another. Like that's just, it makes it very, very difficult. Like if the control deck is playing against, like, let's just take Mono Nature midrange as an example. If you're trying to answer like really problematic big evos like Ralkor and Anjak, the best way to approach that is to just try to deal with all the bait and make it so that you can really slow or delay the time where your opponent can actually drop those big evolution creatures, or maybe strand them or maybe you try to strand those evolutions in your opponent's hand and pick them out with discard spells. But Tricky Turnip, just being this bait that you can never remove, is just makes that game plan really untenable. And Keeper of Laws, the spell siphon ability is obviously just super warping in its own right, and makes those kind of discard plans with like things like Maddening Whispers super untenable as well. And Keeper of Laws as well, just I think I talked about it in the light video, it really pushes the reactive decks into this space where they have to be, like, they don't have a choice. Even if they'd probably be playing Andromeda and all these cards anyways, they certainly don't have a choice anymore when you introduce Keeper of Laws into the equation. So I think these are super problematic cards for the game that I think need to go for sure. Continuing on, there's Broodmother, which I'm not as sure about. I think it's a little too strong. Another like super powerful proactive card that nets you advantage. I think it's too good of an advantage card. Too big a body as well, like especially in a world without Herald to punish Broodmother. It's just, yeah, I think the card's a little too good. It makes it very difficult on any kind of reactive deck, and yeah, it's just like I think Anjak's like a really strong card. Without Broodmother, it's still going to be strong. Like maybe you can resort to cards like Gigahorn Charger or something like that to pair well with Anjak, but Broodmother is just takes that synergy to another league where it just makes it so difficult for any kind of slower deck to compete. Anything that's trying to play like a mid-rangey, over the top kind of mid-rangey control game, like Kalima control, or for example, Mono Nature can play this whole other axis where they can not only can they be the incredibly fast proactive nature deck, or sorry, evolution based deck where they're just spamming huge evolutions and then just pushing at your shields incredibly fast, but they can also slow down the pace super well, and they use Broodmother to really bridge them into the late game where they can just dig for Boulder Fist, and then Boulder Fist you can just Boulder Fist your opponent out of the game because you have the ability to generate so much extra resource on your opponent through Broodmother. I think it's a little bit too good. Another card that I think is too good is Lyra. A bit of an innocuous card, but I think it's really warping in its own right. It's just like the dominant 6-drops, the dominant mid-range card. I mean, maybe Finbarr more so, but Lyra's just another huge reason to play light, and one that just gets jammed in all these light decks. And I think maybe this alone is like hitting this card gives a little bit more reason to be playing other cards, and maybe frees up some space, and maybe or frees up some ability to be playing some other civilizations instead, where you don't have to wonder or feel bad about giving up on a card like Lyra. I don't know. It's kind of weird, but I think it's a little too good to to be legal. I think it's the third or fourth best card in the game, and or maybe top five in the game. So I think it should just go on that basis alone. Um, Next up would be, I guess, Haven. This is one that comes with kind of a side discussion where when you're discussing if you should ban Haven or not, it's really kind of a discussion about what you want the top end card to be in Kaijudo, or how you want this giant thing's arms race to develop. Um, it's sort of where you draw the line, I guess. Do you want the best thing at the top end to be Eternal Haven? Do you want it to be, or I guess, like, yeah, what do you want the trump card to be for the control matchup? Do you want it to be Haven? Do you want it to be Tritonus? Do you want it to be Infernus Awaken? Do you want it to be Cassiopeia? You could sort of draw a line, like maybe Tritonus is a little too good and maybe draws the control decks to be playing these kind of super long, maybe you think they're unhealthy game plans. Maybe not. Maybe Tritonus it's really hard to stabilize to Tritonus without something like Andromeda. And maybe it's just like a fun card. Maybe it's the one you want. So wherever you choose to draw the line on the giant, impressively powerful big things, it's probably going to be drawn after Haven. So I think Haven is the first one to go. You could carry on that discussion with what else. I think making it so that it's not a light card is a benefit, though. That way you can kind of choose, because like Cassiopeia is a super powerful card, but it's not necessarily this like inevitability, or it's not the most inevitable card, right? Your opponent can always Terra Pit it away or do something along those lines. So maybe it's Tritonus, but then Tritonus has its host of issues as well. So I think it's kind of healthy to make it not a light card, like Eternal Haven, where maybe you can play like a water-based control deck, or a water control deck with Tritonus at the top end, and you don't need to run, and then you won't have to worry about getting trumped by something like Eternal Haven, and you won't, and Andromeda and all that. So I think it's healthy to not be a light card, so that maybe you can get by just playing like Water Dark Fire or Water Dark Nature Control, or maybe you do play Water Dark Light Control. But I think wherever you draw the line on huge things, it's not going to be, it's going to be after Haven. So that would be kind of my core 9 cards that I would ban. I think like the four super strong light cards, and some of the most the four super strong light cards, maybe opening up some room for control, or for light to be or a little bit less played, or maybe a little bit less necessitated in certain archetypes. Like Haven's not the best card, especially in the wake of Andromeda, but it's like a card that really is tough to compete with, so it's like one of the most warping light cards. Just removing these makes it so you can maybe a lot more of the competitive between civilizations, and then I think these whole 4 cards just open the door where reactive decks can much more effectively, or they're not under as much pressure, and they're not as unviable as they were. I think another card to consider would be Blinder Beetle Prime. Just another very oppressive card against like creature decks, but it's something that can be answered and dealt with somewhat effectively. Like if you're able to afford, or if you open the room for reactive decks to exist, like being able to strand, like I talked about, to strand evolutions in your opponent's hand by just effectively dealing with their bait cards, you can sort of mitigate Blinder Beetle Prime and the effectiveness of it, especially if you're not relying on tons of creatures yourself, because you can afford to play a bit more of a reactive game. I think like in evolution, creatures have an inherent weakness to them, and I think it's, for the most part, it's fine. Like maybe Blinder Beetle Prime is a little too powerful in the Blinder Beetle Prime mirrors, and it's certainly going to be one of the strongest remaining cards. But there's some like healthy counterplay to it. So maybe it's too good. Maybe it should belong on the ban list. But I think it's fine for the most part. Aside from that, like there were other cards you could like there's so many things that are really strong that like I talked about. You could just kind of hit everything good and try to shake up the meta that way. But I think these are the most problematic ones. Like when you're looking at making reactive cards a bit better, like maybe you want to look to like the big things like Swordhorn because it dodges like a lot of the red removal, and you want to make that a little more viable. But I think Swordhorn can still be answered fairly well. Like it can still be bounced, it can still be Bone Blades, etc. Like there's enough counterplay, and I think that's mostly a fine card. Um, and then if you hit Swordhorn, are you also going to hit Lost Patrol like that? And then you kind of go down that rabbit hole of hitting everything good. I don't know. I think there's discussion to be had there. I think another card is like Cyber Scamp, but I think Cyber Scamp also has some vulnerabilities, and it's a little bit easy to counter with just some blockers, and your own creatures can effectively deal with it. It's weak to something like Screeching Scaradorable. Maybe Cyber Scamp you don't want just because it's a little bit too good of a... It might be a little bit too punishing against these reactive decks. I could see that argument. So maybe like Cyber Scamp would be another card that would be... I actually was considering, I think when I was first thinking about my ban list, Cyber Scamp was a card that was on it, but I sort of dropped it as I went on. But yeah, for the most part, I think I touched on most of what I wanted to cover. Yeah, as always, let me know any of your thoughts on what you might do with your own ban list. What cards maybe you think I missed, or what cards maybe I shouldn't ban. Yeah, just kind of cover what cards or how you might approach something like this, or what problems you think there are in Kaijudo. Yeah. On top of that, let me know what videos you might like to see going forward. If there's any other discussion topics, any deck profiles. But with all that said, another long video in the books. I hope you all watching enjoyed, and yeah, thanks for watching to begin with. I'll see you next time. Bye.